In this video, what I want to do is spend some time talking about the 1997 UK general election as part of a sort of mini-series in this particular topic on elections and voting, examining a few case studies looking at 1979, looking at 1997, 2010, 2017, and 2019. So this lesson specifically will focus on the context and the background associated with the 1997 election. We will talk about the campaign that was run by both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. And we will think about the voting behaviour, the demographics, and the results around the 1997 election before finally thinking about its impact and its significance. So, the 1997 general election marked was marked in the UK as a significant moment when thinking about the Labour Party because they achieved a landslide victory after 18 years of Conservative rule. This was done under the leadership of Tony Blair, and the shift away from a much more further left political party to a more left of centre political party under New Labour. Now, in terms of the background and context, you have to remember that by the mid-1990s, the Conservative Party was led by John Major and had been facing a significant number of challenges. The first of this was in the use of, or at least the phenomenon of economic recession and the impact of the 1992 Black Wednesday crisis. The Black Wednesday crisis, for those of you who don't know, essentially was when the United Kingdom was forced to withdraw from the European exchange rate mechanism. This was something that had damaged quite significantly the reputation of the Conservatives. The Conservatives have historically been seen as a political party with a reputation for economic competence. When Black Wednesday happened and the UK had to withdraw from the EER, this then led to a situation in which the Conservatives' stellar reputation on the economy was shattered. In addition to this, a number of scandals and infighting within the Conservative Party, especially when it came to issues surrounding corruption and allegations of corruption, issues that were collectively known as sleaze, led to further eroding of trust in the government of the time. In contrast to the failures and the decline of the Conservative Party, we also see the rise of a new Labour Party under a new leader. This was Tony Blair, who had modernised his image and distanced himself from the more traditional left-wing policies of his previous counterparts, people like, for example, Michael Foot. Labour's leadership and the party's adoption of a more left-of-centre platform marked the phase known as New Labour, and this was an attempt to appeal to a broader electorate, including a number of traditional Conservative supporters who maybe were less on the right than some of the politics of the Conservative Party of old, but were not left-wing enough to be able to see themselves supporting someone like, for example, Michael Foot. This sort of centrist and sort of centre-left political party was seen as a more friendly place for the traditional Conservative supporters, who were, like I said, disillusioned with the state of the country at the time. We also have to think about the impact of a number of other elements. So, for example, the Liberal Democrats were ran by Paddy Ashdown, who is cited here, who's imaged here on screen. The Liberal Democrats were also a significant force in this election. They were able to position themselves as an alternative to both the Conservatives and the Labour Party, although when it came to the final outcome, they would have quite little in terms of an impact. So, in terms of election issues, the economy was one of the most important of them, and as it is the case in pretty much every single election. The Conservatives' economic management was under attack. The country had experienced significant economic instability throughout the 1990s. There was recession in the early 1990s, there was the fallout from Black Wednesday, and Labour were able to capitalise on these issues, and they tried to emphasise that there would be economic competence under the leadership of Tony Blair. In addition to this, there would be, in the Labour manifesto, a promised substantial amount of constitutional reforms. So there would be devolution legislation that would be introduced in Scotland and Wales, which would give them power to legislate on their own issues beyond the scope of Westminster. There would be promises to reform the House of Lords. There would be promises to incorporate the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic legislation with the Human Rights Act, and there would be constitutional reform when it came to the establishment of a Supreme Court. In terms of the other issues, education and health was also a major factor. Blair focused on improving public services, such as the National Health Service, as well as the education system. And the Conservatives had been perceived, by contrast, as weakening the power and the authority of the NHS, while Labour promised to prioritise the funding and reform of the National Health Service. And so you can understand that when we get to the actual results, we can see that the Labour Party definitely were able to revitalise the traditional working class base, who were also attracting new supporters as well, including middle class voters who had previously supported the Conservatives. Now, we can see as well that there was a decline in the Conservative Party. They lost support across many of the traditional Conservative areas, especially when we think about urban areas in the north of England, where Labour had actually made the most significant gains. In addition to this, the Conservatives were particularly weak when we think about their performance in regions. So, for example, in Scotland and Wales, where Labour's appeal was actually the strongest. Now, in terms of the Liberal Democrats, they also had made some gains, particularly in southern England and some of the rural constituencies. Again, while not having much significant effect over the overall outcome, this would take away from a number of the Conservative strongholds and Conservative traditional voters. Finally, then, before we look at the election results themselves, the media would play a role in shaping the perceptions of the election. There was a significant shift in the way in which the Labour Party was covered by the media. The tabloid press, for example, had begun to soften its stance on Tony Blair's leadership. They had been previously relatively hostile to Labour, but they gained popularity, the Labour Party, under the leadership of Tony Blair, most notably the Sun newspaper being particularly pro-Blair during this time. All of this would result in the following the following statistics. Labour would win 418 seats. The Conservative Party would only get 165. The majority, therefore, was 179 seats, which is the largest majority in parliamentary history. Labour's victory, therefore, was a landslide. Tony Blair became the youngest Prime Minister in British history, in fact, at the age of 43. They won many constituencies that had been traditionally Conservative, and the Conservatives suffered their worst defeat since 1832, losing 178 seats. Now, in terms of the voter turnout, we can see that the overall turnout was still relatively high. 71.3% of the electorate turning out to vote is a major achievement, especially compared to more recent elections. This was a decrease from the previous election of 1992, which was a 77.7% turnout. But while it was lower than previous elections, it was still a significantly high level of turnout compared to the elections that we see in the future. So what can we conclude and analyse about the 1997 general election? Well, we obviously have to think about the regional voting patterns. In Scotland, for example, Labour's dominance was in fact particularly absolute. The SNP was not particularly strong during this period. They only won 6 seats, should I say, whereas the Labour Party took 56% of the seats. Labour's share of the vote in Scotland was overwhelming. When it comes to Wales, Labour also performed strongly. They won 39 out of 40 of the seats in the country of Wales, where the Liberal Democrats made some inroads. Labour's position was still nevertheless dominant. When it came to the traditional conservative heartlands in England, Labour managed to make considerable inroads there as well, particularly when thinking about urban environments. Labour won many constituencies in the industrial north that had traditionally been strong for the Tories, at least in the last 18 years, and especially also areas like London and the Midlands. The only area in which the Conservatives remained strong were in some parts of southern England, but they still nevertheless lost seats to the Labour Party there as well. As a sort of general conclusion then, the 1997 election marked an end to the 18 years of Conservative rule, which began in 1979 under Margaret Thatcher. The Labour Party returned to power for the first time since 1979 with the ousting of James Callaghan, and Labour's victory reshaped the British political landscape. This was a period of New Labour that would last from 1997 all the way to 2010. Tony Blair's leadership represented the modernised and more centrist approach to the Labour Party, abandoning some of the more traditional left-wing policies that were heavily focused on the ideas such as things like nationalisation, and instead focused on more market-friendly policies that still had something of a progressive and to the left-of-centre approach. They also would continue to think about social justice and the reform of public services, and all of these things therefore made that Tony Blair had a certain appeal to the middle class, which helped Labour to gain significant electoral wins across areas in which voters would traditionally not have voted for the Labour Party. In terms of what would then come in the late 1990s, should I say, and the sort of early years of New Labour, we see that devolution takes place with Scotland and Wales legislation in 1998, and you also have the Human Rights Act also passing in 1998, as well as the Good Friday Agreement as well towards the end of the millennia. The impact that this had on the Conservative Party marked a significant shift. The Conservative Party was left in a state of disarray. They had to struggle with a number of internal divisions, as well as new issues such as the role of Europe and the role of the party in a post-Thatcher era. Now, only did the Conservative Party only manage to be able to reposition itself after a number of elections would take place, and it wasn't until 2010 that the Conservative Party would return to power under the leadership of David Cameron. And so this political shift was seen as a major turning point, signalling again the end of the consensus from 1979, which was sort of known as the post-war consensus. And it marked a shift of political domination by New Labour and a more market-driven political economy. And so generally, if we were to sort of conclude and to sort of summarize this particular election, it was a decisive moment in political history, as all of these elections were, and it was a landslide victory for Tony Blair, marking the end of Conservative rule and marking the beginning of a new Labour realm. This period of time was, of course, a period which was marked by a number of controversies, especially when we think about foreign policy under Tony Blair. But again, that's beyond the scope of this series of lessons. The next lesson we'll think about the period that follows the New Labour governments, and we'll talk about the 2010 general election, which resulted in the establishment of a new coalition.